When we talk about warfare, our minds often conjure these really vivid images. The deafening roar of artillery, maybe the chilling flash of gunfire piercing the night, or just the ground-shaking devastation of a bomb.
Absolutely. Those are the sort of conventional pictures of conflict.
Exactly. But what if the deadliest threat wasn't something you could see, or hear, or maybe even feel until it was already, too late? What if the weapon itself was alive?
That's the chilling premise, isn't it?
Today, we are talking about the silent, invisible scourge of biological weapons. These living agents like spores, insidious viruses, potent toxins, things that can spread unchecked, terrorizing entire populations without a single gunshot ever being fired.
It's a fundamentally different kind of terror.
It really is. And it's a chilling journey into history we're taking, one where, the incredible advancements of science have been systematically subverted, twisted from tools of healing and understanding into instruments of destruction that operate in the deepest shadows.
And that's precisely our mission for this deep dive. We're going to try and unpack the terrifying, evolving trajectory of this particular kind of threat.
Right.
We've pulled from a really diverse array of sources for this, everything from meticulous historical accounts of those early kind of desperate gambits in the 19th century, right through to the massive covert operations of the Cold War, and even into the very real, very unsettling contemporary risks that linger today.
Okay.
Our goal isn't just to recount history, though. It's to extract the critical insights, the surprising and, frankly, often deeply unsettling facts to help you become truly well-informed on a subject that, it's often overlooked, but it's one of the most persistent and quietly dangerous threats humanity faces.
Yeah.
It's about understanding not just what happened, but maybe why it happened, the subtle shifts in intent and capability, and how these past actions continue to shape our present vulnerabilities and, future challenges.
Absolutely. So just to be crystal clear, our topic for this deep dive is the dark history, the insidious progression, and I guess the enduring threat of biological weapons.
That sums it up.
And this isn't just going to be a chronological overview. We're aiming for a thorough, yet hopefully engaging exploration that will make sense of a complex, often disturbing sequence of events.
Yeah, there are definitely layers here.
You might think you know this story, but I promise you there are layers here that will truly surprise and maybe challenge your perspective. So prepare yourself for a journey into the deepest shadows of warfare and the hidden science behind it all. Okay, so our chilling journey into the history of biological weapons, it actually begins long before the modern era. We have to go way back into the 1800s.
Right, before we even really understood germs properly.
Exactly. To truly grasp the significance of these early attempts, you have to put yourself in that time. Imagine a world where the understanding of germs was, let's just say rudimentary.
Very basic, yeah.
People knew disease existed, obviously, and they certainly knew it killed often far more effectively than any army, right?
Oh, absolutely. Disease was the biggest killer on most battlefields back then.
But the microscopic world of bacteria, viruses, the actual mechanisms of infection, that was largely still a mystery. Germ theory was only just beginning to take hold.
A nascent scientific revolution, yeah.
It would forever change medicine, but also, terrifyingly, warfare. Yet even then, on the chaotic, brutal battlefields of the American Civil War, where diseases like dysentery, typhoid, smallpox were just rampant, more consistent killers than bullets or cannons.
A constant threat in the camps.
That's where we find the earliest kind of desperate attempts at biological warfare. The chilling idea of using sickness as a deliberate weapon was somehow already taking root.
That's such a crucial historical context to understand. Disease absolutely decimated armies during that period. I mean, poor sanitation, soldiers crammed into close quarters, limited medical knowledge.
A recipe for disaster.
Completely. A camp could be wiped out by illness far faster than by enemy fire. And it's against this backdrop that we find these persistent rumors and actually some quite credible allegations during the American Civil War about Confederate attempts to intentionally infect Union troops.
Right. I've heard about this.
Yeah, the most prominent story centered around using smallpox-contaminated clothing and blankets.
Smallpox.
Yeah. There were reports, for instance, of attempts to send bales of infected goods north, maybe even using agents to try and spread disease directly. One particularly disturbing account describes a plot to infect northern cities by distributing smallpox-laden clothing that they got from Confederate hospitals.
Wow.
Now, it's really vital to understand these were not sophisticated, lab-engineered bioweapons like we might think of today.
Not like in the movies.
Not at all. This wasn't about some grand strategic bioattack. These were incredibly rudimentary gambits, really born out of a profound sense of desperation.
A last-ditch effort.
Pretty much. A last-ditch effort and a very basic, albeit terrifying, understanding that disease could devastate an enemy force, maybe even more thoroughly than conventional weapons. Now, the effectiveness of these specific attempts, that's widely debated. Most historians suggest they probably had limited, if any, widespread impact. They often failed due to, a lack of scientific understanding or just basic logistical capability.
Right. They didn't really know how to make it work reliably.
Exactly. But what's truly fascinating here, and deeply unsettling, is that even without a deep scientific grasp of microbiology or germ theory, the devastating potential of disease was recognized.
And embraced.
And horrifyingly embraced. These early acts, crude as they were, represented the very first seed, you could say, of the idea of weaponizing disease. And that seed, unfortunately, wouldn't just be nurtured. It would grow exponentially with every subsequent scientific advancement in germ theory, microbiology, and eventually, genetics. It really shows a fundamental human instinct, perhaps, to exploit any vulnerability, no matter how ethically abhorrent it might seem.
It's incredible, isn't it? Even without the modern scientific understanding to reliably weaponize these things, the sheer instinct to inflict disease for tactical advantage was unmistakably there.
The idea preceded the technology.
Yeah. These rudimentary acts reveal this chilling constant across human conflict, that fundamental human drive to exploit any vulnerability, even when the underlying science is barely understood. The instinct for biological warfare, it turns out, actually predates microbiology itself.
It's a sobering thought.
It really makes you consider where the moral lines begin to blur, even way back then, long before we had the technological capability to unleash true biological scourges on an industrial scale. It's just a dark, maybe pragmatic side to human nature, always seeking an edge, regardless of the means. Okay, let's fast forward a few decades. We arrive at World War I.
The Great War.
And this was a conflict that became infamous, of course, for its horrific and widespread use of chemical warfare. The mustard gas, the chlorine.
The images are iconic, tragically so.
Yeah, those images of soldiers choking in the trenches are just burned into our collective memory. It was a new, horrifying dimension to industrial-scale conflict.
Absolutely.
But what's often overlooked, what remained quieter and far more insidious, was the less known, but still significant, alleged use of biological agents during this very same period.
Right. While the gas attacks made the headlines and defined the horror of the trenches, biological tactics were playing a different, more silent game.
Okay, tell us about that.
Indeed. While chemical warfare dominated the headlines and the battlefields of WWI, there was this covert sort of strategic shift towards biological sabotage that aimed to cripple the enemy's capacity to fight.
Sabotage, okay.
Yeah. Historical accounts and intelligence reports strongly suggest that the German army undertook deliberate actions to infect horses and mules used by the Allies.
Horses and mules, why them specifically?
Well, think about how armies operated back then. They were still incredibly reliant on animals. Horses and mules were the vital transportation arteries, the heavy lifters of the war machine.
Right, moving supplies, artillery.
Exactly. They pulled artillery pieces through the mud, transported critical supplies like food, ammunition, medical equipment right to the front lines. They were essential for troop mobility.
Right.
Without them, an army would literally grind to a halt.
So targeting the animals was targeting the supply lines.
Precisely. The primary pathogens the Germans are believed to have used were anthrax.
Anthrax again?
Yeah, which causes severe illness and death in livestock, and of course can affect humans too. And also glanders, which is a highly contagious and often fatal disease in horses, donkeys, and mules, also transmissible to humans.
Nasty stuff.
Very. And the strategic objective here becomes incredibly insightful when you think about it. The goal wasn't necessarily direct human casualties on a massive scale, at least not initially with these specific biological attacks. Instead, the intent was to cripple the enemy's logistical backbone, to disrupt their war-making capacity from within.
Okay.
Imagine the chaos. Sick and dying animals collapsing on supply routes, vital wagons stuck, entire cavalry units just debilitated.
It would completely snarl things up.
Severely impede mobility, disrupt critical supply lines, and, as a devastating secondary effect, undermine troop morale as soldiers watch their essential support animals suffer and die.
Yeah, that would be demoralizing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So these actions, while maybe not as overtly dramatic or headline-grabbing as a gas attack, nonetheless sowed significant chaos and had a profound, albeit silent, impact on the war effort. It was effectively an early form of economic and logistical warfare.
Right.
It was, in many ways, an unacknowledged precursor to what we now call asymmetric warfare, long before that term even entered our lexicon. Striking at a hidden, yet absolutely critical vulnerability in the enemy's infrastructure. It shows a cold, calculated analysis of how disease could be strategically leveraged beyond just direct combat.
That's a chillingly calculated move, isn't it? This wasn't about a direct attack on soldiers in a trench. It was about indirect incapacitation, about breaking the war machine from within by targeting its most fundamental support systems. This shift in strategy from direct killing to logistical disruption and undermining morale, it signifies a really profound evolution in the understanding of how disease could be weaponized.
It does. It shows a move from those earlier, desperate, crude attempts to a more strategic, systemic deployment of biological agents. The intent clearly changes here.
It moves beyond just simple infection.
Right. To leveraging disease as a sophisticated, if silent, strategic weapon. It's a truly chilling progression in the thought process behind warfare.
And it highlights how quickly the strategic implications of disease were grasped once the science began to catch up, even if only partially. Now we need to transition to what is arguably the darkest, most horrific, and utterly indefensible biological campaign in modern history.
Yeah, this is a tough one.
Japan's infamous Unit 731, operating throughout the 1930s and extending right through World War II. We really need to set a somber tone for this segment because the details are truly deeply disturbing.
They really are. It's a profound stain on humanity.
This is where scientific advancement just collided with utter depravity.
This chapter represents the absolute nadir, the lowest point of human experimentation and biological warfare. Unit 731 was this vast, secret research and development facility set up by the Japanese Imperial Army in occupied Manchuria.
Secret, right? How secret?
Well, to the outside world. To maintain this veil of secrecy and deception, it was officially disguised as a water purification plant.
A water purification plant?
Yeah, seemingly innocuous, a civilian utility. In reality, it was hell on earth, dedicated to the research, development, and eventual deployment of biological weapons, operating on an industrial scale.
And who was behind it?
This monstrous unit was spearheaded by General Shiro Ishii. He was apparently a brilliant but utterly ruthless microbiologist who saw human lives as well as mere experimental subjects.
Okay.
The scale of the atrocities committed within Unit 731 is just staggering, almost beyond comprehension. Thousands upon thousands of Chinese civilians, Korean freedom fighters, Russian prisoners of war, other captured individuals, they were subjected to unimaginable systematic experiments.
These weren't volunteers.
Absolutely not. They were victims, dehumanized, and referred to chillingly as maruta, which means logs, stripped of their humanity entirely. They were intentionally infected with some of the deadliest pathogens known to humanity: bubonic plague, cholera, anthrax, typhoid, dysentery, even tuberculosis.
The list goes on.
And the brutality was extreme and systematic. Victims weren't only infected, but also subjected to vivisections,
Which means?
dissected alive, without anesthesia, to study the progression of diseases within their bodies, observing the effects on organs as they happen.
It's unimaginable.
Other experiments include things like frostbite testing, where they'd freeze limbs and then thaw them to study gangrene. Even crude, fatal attempts to determine the limits of human endurance to various conditions and diseases.
Just pure cruelty disguised as science.
Exactly. But Unit 731 didn't stop at experimentation within its secluded walls. They moved to deliberate, large-scale deployment against civilian populations.
And civilians? How?
They targeted entire cities in China, like Ningbo, Chongde, and others, using horrifying tactics. For instance, they dropped these ceramic bombs filled with plague-infected fleas from planes.
Plague fleas.
Yeah.
From planes.
Yes. Unleashing epidemics on unsuspecting civilian populations. They contaminated wells with cholera and typhoid. This wasn't collateral damage. It was a calculated, deliberate act of biological warfare directly against non-combatants, a terrifying precursor to modern bioterrorism.
What was the death toll? Do we even know?
The death toll from Unit 731's operations was immense. Estimates range from tens of thousands, perhaps up to hundreds of thousands of people. The exact number, we may never know.
Why not?
because of the deliberate destruction of records and just the sheer vastness of their impact, but the scale of the human cost is undeniable and horrifying.
And what happened afterwards? To Ishii and the others.
And here's where the story takes an even more profoundly disturbing turn regarding accountability and the pursuit of knowledge. After the war, as the Allied powers sought to understand the full scope of biological warfare, the scientists behind these horrific atrocities, including General Ishii himself, largely walked free.
Walked free? How?
The reason? Many were granted effective immunity or asylum by U.S. intelligence.
Wait, by the U.S. what?
In exchange, the U.S. gained access to their extensive, gruesome research and data obtained through unspeakable human suffering, which was seen as invaluable for their own nascent biological weapons programs.
So they traded immunity for the research data.
That's the grim reality. It raises this incredibly uncomfortable, enduring question about ethics, intelligence, the pursuit of scientific knowledge at any cost, and the profound moral compromises nations are sometimes willing to make in the name of strategic advantage. It casts a long, dark shadow over the post-war pursuit of biological defense.
It's almost unbelievable, isn't it? The sheer barbarity of the experiments, the deliberate targeting of civilians on such a scale, and then the shocking, almost complete lack of justice for those responsible because of this Faustian bargain.
It's a deeply troubling chapter.
It truly challenges our understanding of morality in warfare and the ethical boundaries of intelligence gathering. The idea that such horrific acts could be committed and then the perpetrators essentially pardoned in exchange for their knowledge, it leaves a lasting, indelible moral stain on history. It forces us to confront the darkest corners of human behavior and the compromises nations are willing to make for strategic advantage, even when those advantages are built on the suffering of countless innocent lives. The shock and the profound ethical implications of Unit 731's legacy, they continue to reverberate, forcing us to ask, what price is too high for knowledge? As horrifying and singular as Unit 731 was in its depravity, it's really crucial to understand that Japan wasn't alone in exploring these dark avenues of biological weapon development.
No, unfortunately not.
Simultaneously and often independently, the Allied nations were also launching and expanding their own biological weapon programs during World War II.
Right.
This illustrates a grim and pervasive reality of conflict. When one side ventures into such ethically fraught territory, others often feel compelled to follow suit.
It creates a terrifying momentum.
Exactly, leading to a terrifying global and secret race for these destructive capabilities, driven by fear and suspicion of what the enemy might be developing.
That's a critical point, and it really speaks to the relentless logic of an arms race, doesn't it? The fear of what an adversary might possess often overrides ethical considerations and drives research, even into areas that are deeply morally problematic.
Oh, so what were the Allies doing?
Well, the United Kingdom, for instance, undertook significant testing of anthrax bombs, not against human targets, let's be clear, but as field trials to assess their effectiveness and persistence.
Where did they do this?
They conducted these experiments on Grunard Island, a small, uninhabited island off the coast of Scotland, starting back in 1942.
Grunard Island. I think I've heard of that. The Anthrax Island.
That's the one. They detonated anthrax bombs, using sheep as test subjects to understand the dispersal and lethality of weaponized anthrax spores. The extreme toxicity of these tests was so severe.
How severe?
So severe that the island remained completely off limits, deemed too contaminated for safe habitation for nearly 50 years.
50 years.
It wasn't fully decontaminated until the late 1980s. It required tons of formaldehyde solution poured over the island to neutralize the spores. That provides a truly tangible and stark example of the lasting danger, the environmental impact, and the incredible persistence of these agents.
It's not just a fleeting threat, then?
Not at all. It's a legacy of poison that can linger for generations.
And what about the United States?
Across the Atlantic, the United States also launched its own secret programs. Initially, they were focused on defense, but they quickly developed offensive capabilities as well.
Where was this happening?
These efforts were centered at Fort Detrick, Maryland. That became the hub for U.S. biological weapons research. In these highly secure labs, agents like anthrax, brucellosis, which is a debilitating bacterial disease, and the extremely potent botulinum toxin were actively cultivated, refined, and prepared for potential battlefield readiness.
Ready to go if needed.
Exactly. The goal was to develop weapons that could be produced on a large scale and effectively deployed. Now, while they were developed and stockpiled, it's important to note that these specific American biological weapons were, fortunately, never actually used in World War II.
Okay, that's something.
They remained in readiness, a capability rather than a deployed weapon. And just add another layer, as these programs were ramping up in the West, driven by the fear of what Germany or Japan might unleash, even darker projects, ones that would come to define a new era of biological threat, were already quietly brewing behind the nascent Iron Curtain in the Soviet Union.
Foreshadowing the Cold War.
Exactly, setting the chilling stage for what would become a silent arms race of unprecedented scale and secrecy.
It truly emphasizes the pervasive nature of this research, doesn't it? Across all the major powers of that era.
It wasn't isolated.
No, it wasn't just one rogue nation. It was a global phenomenon. A desperate arms race fueled by fear and the relentless need for perceived strategic advantage. You have to ask yourself, what kind of fear and uncertainty must have driven these nations who were fighting against such horrific regimes to simultaneously pursue these exact same destructive capabilities?
It's a complex motivation, certainly.
It paints a complex and disturbing picture of a world teetering on the edge, willing to explore any means necessary to survive, even if it meant venturing into the darkest corners of science and morality. The existence of these parallel programs shows that the perceived necessity for these weapons was almost universally accepted once the concept took root. So after the unfathomable horrors of World War II and the continued, clandestine development of these terrifying weapons, the world finally seemed to take a step back. In 1972.
The Biological Weapons Convention, the BWC.
Right. Over 100 nations signed this landmark international treaty, pledging to completely ban the development, production, and stockpiling of these horrific weapons.
A moment of hope, on paper at least.
It really was hailed as such, wasn't it? A global agreement to step back from the brink, a testament to humanity's collective will to prevent another biological catastrophe.
Yeah.
But then
reality bites.
Yeah. As we've learned repeatedly throughout history, especially with clandestine military programs, the reality often diverges sharply from the declared intent. Immediately after that high-minded treaty was signed, the research, the development, the stockpiling, it all continued. Silently, secretly.
Casting a long shadow of deception over international relations. Precisely. The signing of the BWC was indeed a powerful public declaration of intent, a commitment to global disarmament in this specific area.
Yeah.
But behind closed doors, a massive and chilling violation was already underway or soon to be launched within the Soviet Union.
They signed it, but ignored it.
In direct contravention of the treaty they had signed, the Soviets developed an enormous clandestine program known as biopreparat. And this wasn't just small-scale research in some hidden lab. This was industrial scale. A vast network of ostensibly civilian scientific institutes, factories, military facilities, all secretly dedicated to weaponizing biological agents. It was arguably the largest and most ambitious biological weapons program ever conceived.
Wow. What were they making?
They amassed horrifying inventories of weaponized agents, weaponized anthrax designed for aerial dispersal over vast areas, weaponized smallpox.
Smallpox. But that was nearly eradicated.
Exactly. A pathogen that had historically decimated populations and was then thought to be on the verge of global eradication. They weaponized it. And even the Marburg virus, a highly lethal hemorrhagic fever virus.
Oh, it's not good.
And if that wasn't enough, their ambition extended even further, really pushing the boundaries of biotechnology. They actively worked on genetically engineered superbugs.
Superbugs? You mean like designer diseases?
Yeah. Pathogens designed to be potentially more virulent, maybe resistant to existing vaccines or treatments, harder to detect. It demonstrated a terrifyingly advanced and dangerous trajectory in biological weapons research, seeking to create entirely novel threats.
And did anything ever go wrong?
The true inherent danger of such a program became horrifyingly clear to the world in 1979 with the Sverdlovsk anthrax leak.
Sverdlovsk, I remember hearing about that.
This wasn't an intentional deployment, but a catastrophic accident that just underscored the extreme risks involved. A leak occurred from a Soviet military facility near Sverdlovsk, a bioweapons production plant.
What happened?
They released weaponized anthrax spores into the atmosphere, apparently due to a faulty filter that wasn't replaced on time. The wind carried the spores over nearby towns, causing a deadly outbreak.
How many people died?
Initially, the Soviet government officially admitted to only 66 people dying. They blamed it on contaminated meat.
Contaminated meat, seriously.
That was the cover story. But unofficially and more credibly, according to subsequent investigations by Western experts and later by Russian defectors like Ken Alibek, the true death toll was likely in the hundreds, possibly even more. The scale of the cover-up was immense.
That's horrifying.
This incident serves as a stark, chilling reminder of the inherent dangers of these programs, even without intentional deployment. It showed how easily these weapons can escape containment and wreak havoc on civilian populations. It highlights the profound risks of even possessing such capabilities.
And the U.S. side during this period?
Well, the United States claimed to have shut down its own offensive biological weapons program back in 1969, just before the convention came into force.
Claimed.
Well, due to the extreme secrecy surrounding such activities on all sides, skepticism has always lingered regarding the completeness of that shutdown. It hints at the deeply ingrained secretive nature of these programs within a Cold War divide.
What's truly fascinating here, and just deeply unsettling, is the profound hypocrisy of the Cold War era, isn't it?
It's stark.
You have this very public, high-minded treaty signed by over 100 nations promising not to develop these weapons.
Yeah.
Yet simultaneously, behind that iron curtain, a massive hidden arms race was in full swing. This stark illustration of the gap between declared international intent and the hidden reality.
Driven by suspicion.
Driven by suspicion and the relentless pursuit of strategic advantage. It truly makes you question how much trust can ever be placed in such agreements when the perceived need for power overrides all other considerations. It's a sobering lesson on the challenges of arms control and verification in a world driven by mutual distrust.
A legacy we are definitely still grappling with today.
Okay, so as the Cold War eventually thawed, the Berlin Wall came down. The world breathed this collective sigh of relief.
A major shift in the global landscape.
Absolutely. But the threat of biological weapons didn't just, vanish into the history books.
No, unfortunately not. It evolved.
Instead, it merely evolved, adapting to new conflicts, finding unsettling new forms, and emerging from new corners of the globe in the post-Cold War era and right into the 21st century. The echoes of that silent scourge continued to reverberate, often in unexpected places.
Indeed. The shift brought different actors and different types of threats onto the stage, yet the core danger remained. Consider Iraq under Saddam Hussein in the 1980s.
Right, pre-Gulf War.
Following the Iran-Iraq War, and as the Gulf War approached, intelligence agencies worldwide were on high alert because Iraq had secretly created vast stockpiles of weaponized anthrax and botulinum toxin.
Vast stockpiles.
UN inspectors later uncovered evidence of immense production capabilities. For instance, Iraq eventually admitted to producing something like 8,500 liters of concentrated anthrax, enough, they calculated, to fill 166 bombs and over 19,000 liters of botulinum toxin.
That's terrifying capability.
The frightening reality was that they had the capability and potentially the political will to use them, fortunately.
They weren't used.
For reasons that remain subject to intense debate and speculation, maybe fear of massive retaliation, maybe logistical difficulties in deployment, these weapons were never used, not even during the intense conflict of the Gulf War.
Okay.
But the very existence of such capabilities kept intelligence agencies around the world on a constant nervous edge. It demonstrates the continuous vigilance required when dealing with this kind of pervasive and elusive threat.
And it wasn't just states anymore, right?
Exactly. Then you have the chilling example of the Japanese doomsday cult, Ahom Shinrikyo.
The ones who did the sarin gas attack.
That's them. Before their infamous and horrifying 1995 sarin nerve gas attack on the Tokyo subway, which killed 13 people and injured thousands, they had actually made multiple desperate attempts to unleash biological agents first.
Really? What did they try?
Their intent was absolutely clear: to cause mass casualties using biological agents. They attempted to release botulinum toxin and anthrax in Tokyo on multiple occasions in the early 1990s.
No.
They tried releasing it from a building rooftop, even from a vehicle spraying it in a populated area. Crude attempts.
Did it work?
No. The only reason they failed in their biological attacks was due to their astonishing technical incompetence. They just lacked the understanding in how to effectively weaponize and disseminate the agents.
So they were incompetent terrorists, thankfully.
Their attempts at biological terrorism were amateurish and ineffective, leading to no significant casualties. It offers this moment of twisted relief, but
The intent was there.
critically, the intent to use biological weapons was undeniably there, even from non-state actors driven by extremist ideology. It showed it was no longer just the domain of superpowers, the threat was becoming decentralized.
And then came 2001.
However, perhaps the most chilling and consequential moment in modern biological warfare history came in 2001, right in those harrowing days following the 9/11 terror attacks.
Yeah, I remember the fear.
In the midst of all that national anxiety and fears of further external attacks, letters laced with weaponized anthrax spores were sent through the U.S. mail system.
Where did they go?
To various U.S. offices, including prominent media outlets in New York and Florida, and to 2 U.S. senators in Washington, D.C., the consequences were devastating.
How many?
5 people died, including 2 postal workers who handled the letters, and 17 others were infected, suffering severe illness. This event traumatized the nation, reignited fears of bioterrorism, and prompted this massive, unprecedented public health and law enforcement response.
A huge investigation followed.
Massive. But here's the shocking reveal, the critical aha moment for intelligence and public understanding that truly shifted the paradigm. The extensive years-long investigation ultimately concluded that the deadly spores weren't from foreign terrorists.
Not Al-Qaeda.
No, not a sophisticated overseas plot. They were traced back to a U.S. Army lab,
What?
Fort Detrick, the very same facility that had developed these agents decades earlier.
An insider.
The FBI concluded it was likely the work of one scientist there, though he died before charges could be filed. This revelation fundamentally shifted the focus. It highlighted not only the persistent danger of external threats, but also the profound internal vulnerabilities, the potential for domestic misuse, accidental release, or insider threat within our own highly secure facilities.
That 2001 anthrax attack truly was a watershed moment, wasn't it? It completely upended so many assumptions about where the next major biological threat might come from.
It really did change the conversation.
What's truly unsettling here is that the source of the threat wasn't a foreign adversary launching some sophisticated attack,
No.
but something much closer to home, emerging from our own national security infrastructure. It forces us to reflect on the unsettling nature of these modern incidents, particularly that anthrax attack. What are the profound implications when the perceived external threat turns out to be an internal vulnerability?
Or even a tragedy originating from within our own advanced research facilities.
Exactly. It adds this layer of complexity and a profound sense of unease to the entire conversation about biological weapons. It suggests the threat landscape is far more intricate and multifaceted than we often imagine. Which brings us directly to the present day. And we stand at this really complex crossroads, facing what I can only describe as an enduring paradox when it comes to biological weapons.
Yeah, paradox is a good word for it.
On one hand, there's this strong international consensus against them, embodied by legal bans like the BWC.
Right, the treaties exist.
But on the other hand, the very knowledge and the tools required to create them are more pervasive, more accessible, and more sophisticated than ever before. It feels like a really delicate balance between progress and peril.
You've absolutely hit on the core of the contemporary challenge, and it's a profound one. While biological weapons are legally banned by international treaties like the Biological Weapons Convention, which, by the way, over 180 states have now ratified.
It's good coverage.
It is. But the stark reality is that the underlying scientific knowledge and the technological means to create these agents are incredibly widespread and rapidly advancing.
And how is that happening? Not through sharing weapon secrets, presumably?
No, not usually. It's largely due to the explosive advancements in legitimate scientific fields, breakthroughs in areas like synthetic biology, where scientists can essentially design and construct new biological parts, devices, systems from scratch. Then there's CRISPR gene editing.
The gene editing tool we hear so much about.
Exactly, a revolutionary tool that allows for precise, targeted modification of DNA, and just the increasingly sophisticated ability to grow, modify, and manipulate pathogens in labs. These are all phenomenal scientific achievements.
Right, for medicine, agriculture.
Absolutely. They are pursued in the name of medical progress, agricultural improvements, fundamental scientific understanding, pushing the boundaries of what's possible in biotechnology.
But there's a downside.
However, every single one of these advancements comes with what we call a shadowy dual-use potential.
Dual use, meaning?
Meaning the very tools that allow us to cure diseases, develop new medicines, engineer more resilient crops, or rapidly produce vaccines could, in the wrong hands, be weaponized.
Okay, give me an example.
Well, CRISPR, theoretically, could be used to make existing pathogens more virulent, maybe resistant to drugs, or even to try and create entirely novel biological agents that are harder to detect or treat.
Wow.
Synthetic biology allows for the potential to synthesize dangerous viruses from scratch, maybe based on published genome sequences, or to engineer bacteria to produce potent toxins. The knowledge is global, it's democratized to a degree by open source science and readily available equipment.
So the barrier to entry is lower than it used to be.
Potentially, yes, for certain types of threats, though creating truly effective, stable, deliverable weapons still requires significant expertise and resources. But the basic knowledge is out there.
And COVID-19 fits into this picture how?
Well, the COVID-19 pandemic, while certainly not a weapon.
Right. Important clarification.
Very important. But it serves as a powerful and undeniable illustrative example of our global vulnerability. It taught us, on a truly global scale, just how fast a novel virus can emerge, spread, and utterly change the entire world.
It certainly did that.
Disrupting economies, overwhelming healthcare systems, causing immense social upheaval. It wasn't a deliberate attack, but its natural emergence revealed the profound global vulnerability we all share to biological threats, regardless of their origin.
So it was a test case, in a way.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, yes. It laid bare just how unprepared we truly are for widespread biological threats, whether their origin is natural, accidental, or intentional. The pandemic was a brutal stress test for our global health security and biodefense capabilities.
And what did it show?
It showed critical gaps in pretty much everything. Surveillance, rapid response, vaccine development speed, equitable distribution, public health infrastructure resilience, you name it. The knowledge of how to manipulate life is advancing exponentially. And that knowledge, while overwhelmingly beneficial, is also the foundation for potential biological weapons. That makes this an enduring, complex paradox we have to live with.
So what does this all mean for us now, living in this incredibly interconnected world?
Yeah.
We're left with this complex dynamic, the pervasive knowledge, these incredibly advanced tools available to anyone with a lab and sufficient expertise.
Right.
And the very raw, recent lessons learned, or perhaps maybe not yet fully learned, from a natural pandemic that exposed our deepest vulnerabilities.
Mm-hmm.
It underscores the critical, urgent need for robust future preparedness, for strong international biosecurity frameworks, and for unprecedented global cooperation to try and manage this enduring paradox. The threat isn't just a historical footnote, is it?
Not at all. It's a current, evolving, and deeply unsettling challenge that requires constant vigilance and proactive measures.
So let's try and wrap this up. From those rudimentary, almost desperate attempts to infect troops back in the 19th century, driven by just a primal instinct for advantage,
Yeah, where it all began.
to the calculated industrial-scale horrors of Japan's Unit 731, where science was just twisted into pure depravity against civilian populations.
A truly dark chapter.
Then the massive hidden arms races of the Cold War, secretly building stockpiles of genetically engineered threats despite international treaties.
The era of hypocrisy.
And finally, the unsettling domestic attacks of the 21st century, like the anthrax letters, revealing vulnerabilities far closer to home than maybe we wanted to admit. Our deep dive has traced a truly chilling progression.
It really has.
Biological weapons are unique in their horror, aren't they? They don't just kill, they linger. They can mutate. They can terrorize entire populations without a single gunshot, creating fear, chaos, and long-term instability on an unprecedented scale, often with completely invisible means.
And this extensive journey tracing that history brings us to an unavoidable conclusion. As long as the underlying scientific knowledge continues to advance and the means to create and manipulate these weapons remain possible, the threat endures.
It doesn't just go away.
No, it's a silent, persistent danger, waiting quietly at the very edge of what humanity is willing to do to itself. It really compels us, I think, to critically think about the profound ethical dilemmas that constantly arise with scientific advancement and the vital global implications of ensuring these powerful tools are never again subverted for destruction. The lessons of the past are not just history.
No.
They are stark warnings for the future.
Absolutely. And as you mull over everything we've discussed today, maybe consider this final provocative thought. Given the chilling lessons of Unit 731 and the profoundly unsettling 2001 anthrax attacks, How much does the true enduring threat of biological weapons truly come from outside our borders, from foreign adversaries, versus the potential within our own advancements or even the accidental or intentional misuse within our very own labs?
It's a complex question with no easy answers.
Think about the unseen dangers that reside both globally and perhaps far closer to home than we'd like to imagine.